Hello viewers, today I will be discussing on the topic Colonial Exploitation, Forms and Consequences. I am sure this topic will be of great interest to all the viewers because it explains the concept of colonial exploitation and the consequences due to this exploitation. It is a well known fact that British ruled India for more than 150 years. But even prior to the British, there were invaders who invaded India, but the only difference between them and the British rule was that the British tried to adopt certain policies which tried to protect their own interest at the cost of the Indian economy. There was a lot of difference between the British rule because they tried to bring a gap between the rulers and the ruled. The exploitation was in such a manner that it really hit not only the interest of the Indians but the whole economy. We can broadly divide the phases of exploitation under three phases. The first phase, which covers 1757 to 1813. This was a period which was one of direct plunder, in which surplus Indian revenues were used to buy Indian finished goods to be exported to England. Added to this, the East Indian Company bought certain lands in the east and the western parts of the country, and they used this money to exploit the Indians. It was a monopoly of the East Indian Company, and until then the whole system was being controlled by the East Indian Company. The second phase was 1813 to 1858. It was a free trade. India was converted into a source of raw materials and a market for British manufactured goods. When we consider it as a free trade, it was highly beneficial to the British economy because as a supplier of raw materials, as a colony, it tried to take all the raw materials and try to produce and sell back to the Indian market, where it could get a big market being the Indian economy. So it was almost during the second phase that the balance of trade tilted, because earlier to the British rule, always India enjoyed a surplus balance of trade, but after the conquest of the British, and especially because of the free trade, the imports were greater than the exports. Now the third phase was entirely different, which commenced after 1858, and it was one of finance imperialism. This was a period when British capital controlled all the banks, foreign trading firms and managing agencies in India. So through different phases, we find that through their economic and political policies, they tried to control the economy in the interest of the British Empire and subduing the interest of the people of India and the interest of the Indian economy. Let us broadly divide the main forms of colonial exploitation under four subheadings, namely exploitation through trade policies, exploitation through export of British capital to India, exploitation through finance capital via the managing agency system, and last but not the least, exploitation through payments for the cost of British administration, which we call them as home charges. Taking the first one, exploitation through trade policies. This was very critical for the Indian economy because, as I told you earlier, always we enjoyed a surplus balance of trade, but after the British rule, it led to adverse balance of payments, and this is basically because of the trade policies adhered by the British government. They imposed heavy import duties on Indian goods other than the foodstuffs and raw materials. They banned especially the Indian printed cotton fabrics, which were in high competition with the English goods, especially the textiles, and therefore they tried to ban the Indian printed cotton goods. The third one was that they tried to impose nominal duties on the imports of British manufacturers to India and encourage the production of raw materials, especially cotton, jute, sugarcane, groundnuts and silk. The encouragement of raw materials was again only to support their industries, and that was the reason they encouraged production of raw materials. Simultaneously, they discouraged the production of manufactures in India, because if Indians had to manufacture the goods, then automatically we will not be importing any goods from the British Empire. Exploitation of cultivators to boost indigo, and this was especially done by the Britishers to boost indigo, so that they used to give land to the at a very cheap price and ask the farmers to cultivate indigo plantation. And apart from that, some of the zemindaris also were forced to allocate some land for the cultivation of indigo. They would buy from the farmers and the zemindaris at a low price and then sell it in the British market. In case the rights or the zemindaris refused to produce or cultivate indigo on those lands, they were severely punished, and this was one form of harsh exploitation by the Britishers. In an equal manner, there was exploitation of artisans through company agents. The East Indian Company, they appointed some agents, what they called as gumastas, and they were going to the villages, forcing the villagers and especially the artisans to sell especially cotton and good silk at a very low price, almost 15 to 45% less than the market price, so that these agents would sell to the British and make huge profits. So, in one way the farmers were exploited, the artisans were exploited, and totally you find that in the villages almost everybody were exploited, and this had a great severe impact on the village economy. The last point is discriminating protection, which was one form of exploitation through trade policies. Towards the beginning of the 20th century, there was a strong demand by the Indian national movement to protect the Indian industries. In the interest of the Indians, the British government tried to give a discriminating protection, which is nothing but protecting the Indian industries from competition from the other industries other than the Britain. For instance, they protected the match industry, which was in high competition with the Swedish match industry. But when it came to the industries which were directly related to the British Empire, namely cement, chemicals, textiles, no protection was given. So, this was something like giving a most favored nation treatment, that is, all the exports and imports which were coming from Britain were giving a special treatment, but in terms of other competitive units from other parts of the world, they were given some protection. So, in other words, the differential discriminating protection which was given to these Indian industries was whittled away by the special clause given to the British industries. Now, the next phase of exploitation was through export of British capital to India. Now, what was the real reason? Why did the British Empire try to export capital to India? Was it in the interest of the Indian Empire, or was it in their own interest? Certainly, it is not the Indian interest. They wanted to build a better access system for exploiting India's natural resources, and therefore, they tried to make lot of investments on transport and communication, which definitely improves their own economy. The second reason was it provides a quick means of communication for maintaining law and order, and to provide a quicker disposal of British manufactures throughout the country, so that raw materials could be easily procured and finished products could be sold far and wide in the economy. So, in this interest, they tried to export the British capital to India. How did these investments come to India? They took two forms. One is the direct private foreign investment, and secondly is sterling loans given to the British government in India. And through these investments, they tried to make investments in such overheads like infrastructures like railways, shipping, ports, roads, communications, and investment in mining of resources and commercial agriculture investment in consumer goods industries. Here a point to be noted is that they were not interested in making investment in capital goods industries which will really bring about development of the economy, but they were more interested in consumer goods industries. So whatever investments they made was always beneficial to them and detrimental to the Indian economy. Similarly, they made investments in machine buildings, engineering industries and chemicals. So by all these investments, the foreign capital flows increased from nearly 365 million sterlings in 1911 to 1000 million sterlings in 1933. There was a huge capital inflows. By just looking at the capital inflows, one may feel that these are going to be really beneficial, but what has actually happened was there was a drain of resources. The British multinational drained out the wealth of India, and these investments show that British were more interested in creating economic infrastructure to aid exploitation of resource drain. They invested in consumer goods and not basic heavy industries, and ultimately the ownership and management of these companies were in British hands. Only other small services like clerical posts or some other menial jobs were given to the Indians, but ultimately the whole management and ownership was vested in the hands of the British companies. So another form of exploitation was drained through finance capital via the managing agency system. Now what do we understand by managing agency system? This is nothing but the British merchants who had earlier set up firms acted as pioneers and promoters in several industries like jute, tea, coal, and these persons were called as managing agents. They were almost described as partnerships of companies formed by a group of individuals with strong financial resources and business experience. And these managing agencies provided finance to companies. They charged high commission for purchase of stores, equipment, raw material, machinery, sale of output. Sometimes they demanded 12 to 14% of profits for managing the affairs of the company. Suppose the companies incurred any losses, they were so cruel and harsh that they had to pay the margin in terms of even though they incurred losses. The agencies forced the companies to pay remuneration even if the companies suffered loss. This was very inhuman. In case the managed company refused to pay because they were incurring losses, the managing agencies withdrew their finance, and this naturally created a lot of tussle for the companies. In due course, the managing agencies, they started dictating the terms of industries and business, and they became highly exploitative in nature. Apart from this, the exploitation was also in terms of home charges. Now, home charges is nothing but because they were administering the Indian economy, what is the cost of British administration because they were trying to administer the Indian economy. And this was taken up on several fronts. For instance, high salaries for British officers both in military and civil administration. All high positions were held by the British administrators where they were given high salaries. And they were drained through dividends and profits, because earlier I said they made investments in different types like on coal, plantations and mining companies. So all the dividends and profits were also remitted back in terms to the British Empire. They were also drained through the payments for the cost of British administration, and those who retired in their service while working here, their pensions also were remitted back to their home country. The interest paid, because we have borrowed loans for several reasons, even for the construction of railways. So the interest was very high on the sterling debt which was borrowed by the Indian economy. And all these expenditures and the income which the British government gained from the Indian economy, they spent huge amounts on expenditures on wars which they fought with other countries, and this was a colossal loss to the Indian economy because it imposed a heavy drain on the Indian exchequer. Now, we have seen the different types of exploitation in different forms, whether it is as I have earlier mentioned, but what is really with this exploitation, what were the real consequences of British rule? How did it really hampered the Indian economy? And this also can be classified under 4 broad headings, that is, the one direct consequence of the British rule was the decline of Indian handicrafts and ruralization of economy. The second one is growth of new land system and commercialization of Indian agriculture. Third one, it had a severe impact on trade and commerce. And fourth, the drain of resources, and then in the next class we will also be talking about the drain theory. The last, and it is something related to the end of village community. So, the British conquest had a severe blow on these 5 broad features of the Indian economy, starting with the handicrafts, commercialization of Indian agriculture, trade and commerce, draining of resources, and the end of village communities. So, let us look at what were the real causes for decline of Indian handicrafts. One was the Industrial Revolution in England. This has fostered the manufactured goods which were really produced in bulk amount, and therefore, the cost of production of those textiles was very low compared to the Indian handlooms and handicrafts. And second reason was that the quality of those were very good. So, because of the Industrial Revolution, England had a greater advantage when compared to the handicrafts and handlooms of the Indian economy. The second reason was the disappearance of princely courts. Earlier, our handicrafts, handlooms were well supported by the Nawabs, Zamindaris, princely people who really encouraged these artisans to give them the very beautiful artistic value goods, so that they decorated their princely courts and other things. But once there was a disappearance of the princely courts, naturally the demand from these princes was reduced, which hindered the handicraft industry. The third reason is the hostile policy of the East Indian Company, where already we said whatever policies they did was only to encourage their industries at the cost of the Indian industries by giving a special preference treatment. And not only that, all the goods which were imported from Britain and exported from Britain were not given any tariffs, but goods exported and imported from India were always being put a high level of tariff. Competition from machine made goods was directly problematic to the Indian handicrafts, handloom industries, because they could not really survive the competition made by the machine made goods. All these also were not only in terms of the decline of handicrafts, there was lot of development of roads and railways, which made the machine made goods, the exports and imports from British Empire to be penetrated to each corner of the village, so that almost all the village industries, they were suffering because they could not try to really compete with the machine made goods, which penetrated to every nook and corner of the economy due to the development of roads and railways. Last but not the least, the development of new forms and patterns of demand. Already the Western culture has come into the Indian system, and many of them wanted to really try to emulate the nobles and the princely people of the British style. So, they tried to really use their products, and it was like a fashion style, or it was only like something like they wanted to emulate them, and they started demanding more of their products when compared to the Indian products. So, one was in terms of quality, cost, it was better, and secondly they felt that wearing and using those goods give them more status, and that was the reason a new form of demand has crept into the Indian economy, where they started demanding their products at the cost of our products. So, all this naturally led to the decline of handicrafts. Now, what was the real problem when there was a decline of handicrafts? Naturally, many of the people, artisans, remained unemployed because the demand of these products were slowly coming down. And the worst part was that there was a back to land movement where artisans were forced to take up agriculture and they became landless laborers. This increased severe pressure on land, and this trend of growing proportion of the working force on agriculture is described as progressive ruralization. That is, they were forced from industry, they were forced back to the rural economy. It was something like deindustrialization of India, and this naturally brought about crisis in handicrafts industry, which seriously crippled the Indian agriculture. So the drop in handicrafts was also a severe blow to the agriculture because people moved from industry to agriculture, and this had a severe blow both on industry as well as agriculture. As I was telling you, that the consequences of the British rule also brought about commercialization of agriculture. Now, I think before we can really understand the consequences of commercialization of agriculture, let me just try to give you in a nutshell what we mean by commercialization of agriculture. It is nothing but production of crop for sale rather than for family consumption. Earlier, the farmer would try to produce for his own requirements, but today, because there was change in the cropping pattern, they never produced paddy, but they were trying to produce something like jute or cotton, which were beneficial to the industry, especially for the British, and therefore they tried to produce for sale rather than family consumption, and the agriculture has become almost a marketable commodity. So this is what is called as commercialization of agriculture. What is the consequence is that there was a change in cropping pattern, and suddenly because of this there were the entry of middlemen to do business, and the middlemen enjoyed lot of profits at the cost of the farmer because he was a middleman between the farmer and the consumer, where they would try to buy at a low price from the farmer and sell at a high price to the consumer. So this again was a hard hit to the farmers. In one way, this commercialization of agriculture brought about contribution to world market, linkage with the world market, because now the agriculture prices, especially cotton and jute, were related to the prices in the international market, and in the process there were also establishment of certain processing units, and though in certain ways it was hard hit, but the processing units were established. But one should remember, all these jute industries, processing industries which were established by British, they tried to establish in certain places where it was beneficial and where it was where they could get raw material at a very easy manner, but it was not possible for others to establish those industries because all these places were already being established by the Britishers. So therefore, the processing industries and the jute industries and all other industries which were established had a lot of advantage for the industries which were being protected and established by the British people. So the consequences of the commercialization of agriculture, as I told you, there was a substitution of commercial crops for food crops. So once you shift from food crops to commercial, naturally there will be scarcity of food. The farmer was not producing for his self-sufficiency, but he was trying to sell for the market. So this has increased prices of food grains because there was shortage of food grains. Ultimately, it brought about lot of famines, but only few big farmers have benefited from commercialization of agriculture, but most of the small farmers were hard hit. So this again halted the process of industrialization in India because the raw materials and other things which are necessary for industries were also reduced. So trade and commerce, we have three aspects relating to export of machine made goods to India, export of raw materials from India, and development of jute and plantation. And these three aspects also, as I told you, are highly beneficial to the British economy when compared to the Indian economy. Now all this has resulted in drain of resources which constitute several aspects like home charges, remittances, and also high interest paid on the sterling loans. What is more important is that the British conquest led to the end of village communities. Earlier villages were self-sufficient, but with the British rule we find that villages came in contact with other villages. New administrative system was substituted for the old administrative pattern, a destruction of handicraft industries, and finally people started migrating from villages in search of employment, and there was a severe blow for the village communities. So, coming to the end of the lesson, when we look at the colonial exploitation, we can always look at two angles. One is from the Indian angle and other one from the British angle. The British writers and supporters always felt that the British rule had a lot of benefits to the Indian economy, mainly because they considered that British rule provided political unity. They gave a lot of stable governance, and more virgin land was brought under cultivation. Many good, especially tobacco, potatoes, peanuts were introduced by British, and what they considered is that they always introduced modern technology into our economy. They developed infrastructure, roads, railways, irrigation, public works. In other words, they helped us in the process of economic development. So, that is their point of view. But when we try to take from our angle, we know that there was lot of drain of wealth, and all the trade policies had a lot of disadvantage, and we find that from the positive balance of trade we have moved to a negative balance of trade. No doubt they have developed the infrastructure, but we know that this infrastructure was developed to meet their colonial interest. India primarily remained an agrarian economy. We did not develop industrially, and what little handicrafts industries were so popular prior to the British rule were totally decayed. The net result of British policies was poverty, stagnation of Indian economy, and this was done, and naturally it was the Europe and the British economy who benefited by industrialization. So, there is a saying that development of underdevelopment. So, we remain underdeveloped at our cost, their economies try to develop. Therefore, to conclude, we can very strongly say that British rule led to low per capita income, low agricultural output, low level of savings, and low level of human skills. It led to the disintegration of village community, exploitation of Indian peasantry, and decay of handicrafts industries. No doubt Indian economy inherited a crippled economy with stagnant agriculture. Its impact was felt both on urban, rural economy, society, and polity of India. No one can deny that they have really hit hard the Indian economy, and if there was no British conquest, definitely India would have been a very flourishing economy. Thank you very much.